Yes, this is an Apollo-style rocket built and flown in Kitten Space Agency. But not everything went as expected. Hello everybody, and welcome! With all the major improvements in Kitten Space Agency over the past few weeks, I thought maybe we now actually have a game and not just a tech demo at hand. So I decided to go all in and build a multi-stage, multi-vehicle Apollo-style mission. And I started with the payload, the lunar lander. So we now have docking in the game, we have staging in the game, we have a sort of vehicle editor in the game. So here is what I came up with. This should be the ascent stage. You've seen at the beginning I tried out a couple of docking ports because they all look the same kind of in the vehicle parts picker, but there are some subtle differences, mainly cosmetic in nature, or at least so I think. I, by the way, did an entire video about the vehicle editor and all the changes that the developers made to it. So if you're interested in this type of thing, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you won't miss an update. Alright, we of course need a second stage, a descent stage. Yes, I wanted to make a two-stage lunar landing vehicle just like in the Apollo days. And since this vacuum engine on the bottom of this does not have any attachment points, I had to get creative. So I used the radial attachment decouplers, and I used the gizmo that changes the scale of things to make everything kind of like a ring around this central stack for the ascent stage. Yeah, it does not align perfectly, but you get the idea. And then of course we also need some descent engines. And those were of course much too big, but before we get to that, I fiddled around with the staging, as you can see on the right hand side, because the game threw everything in the same stage, and I wanted of course the descent stage as the second stage of this lander. Once again, I relied on the scale tool to make these descent engines a little bit smaller so they would not stick out like a sore thumb. But here another limitation rears its head, so if you scale something, the attachment nodes stay the same, so then you have to go to the translation gizmo. Let's test this thing. Yes, we have landing legs, we have engines working, everything is looking fine. And we can land on Luna's surface with a little bit of lunar dust spilling around. Yeah, okay, that works fine. So how about the ascent stage? Does my decoupling and firing of the engine work as I intend? And it appears it does. I think this is a way how we can make this work. Alright, for the command and service module replica sort of, I relied on basically, which is almost the same default rocket that you have in the game when you start it. By the way, not really. Now with the latest version, where they actually changed a lot of things which breaks old save games and old vehicles, so be aware of that. In the latest iteration, the default launch vehicle rocket is now a lot bigger and has a second stage with a lot more delta V. And what you can see here is that I listened to you guys and also the developers who told me that if you right click on the capsule, you can actually save the vehicle. You don't have to go through the rigmarole that I did in my previous video. Here we have the thing that I want to do to make this an actual Apollo stack. So I loaded my lander that I built previously, and then I attached it to the docking port I already prepared here. What I want to do is to hide this lander, or at least as much as I can of this lander, inside the cavity of the decoupler. And it looks like those RCS modules are a bit in the way, but even if I put them a little bit further in, they're still in the way, so I relied on the rotation tool to rotate them in such a way that they would align up with these slots within the decoupler, and I could still pull it a little bit higher. So how do we get this decoupler into the center without a center node where we can attach it, since I told you earlier that the vacuum engine does not have a node to attach stuff to? Since there is nothing to wobble in this game compared to Kerbal Space Program, I don't think the vehicle physics are completely finished yet. I just attached this to one of the outer tanks of the descent stage and then wiggled it with the translation tool until it was hopefully somewhat in the center. And it was way too big, so I once again used the scale tool to make it a little bit more palatable for what I thought would be a good part for some sort of fairing to put around this. So it would look like the Apollo 3rd stage cowling or fairing, or what you want to call it, the cone-shaped thing on the top. But the proportions aren't really there. But then this is still early days and we don't have a lot of parts compared to Kerbal Space Program. I mean, there are a lot of parts, but not that many, and we also don't have part mods yet. Once again, using the scale tool to make everything a little bit bigger so it fits to the Apollo style here. Or at least Saturn V style, since Apollo was the program, but the rocket was the Saturn rocket. Now we want to go to the second stage after we've done the payload and the third stage. And once again, I relied on this cargo part to get the cone-shaped adapter going to go from the third stage to the second stage, and of course using the scale tool here. And on the bottom of that second stage, I have used 4 of the engines, also using the scale tool to make them a little bit bigger. I added a second tank to it, or a third even as well later on, because I realized I didn't have enough Delta V to do everything I wanted to do. These scale things that I'm doing here, they're mainly just for visual effect, since it does not increase the mass, it does not increase the fuel capacity, it just looks bigger, which is fine by me for the time being. Okay. Now to the big one, the first stage that's going to punch us out of the atmosphere, hopefully. So what I did, I used a center stack with an engine and then 4 copies of that around that. And then once again, I relied on the scale tool to increase the center stack's tanks so it looked like one piece of a stage, which is what I'm doing here, as you can see. And then to top things off, a little bit of a visual flourish, because they don't really do anything else, to have these fairing parts down here for some visual extra, like, you know, the Saturn V also had these things on the bottom, but of course those were functional. Alright, and with this, our Catpollo rocket, our Saturn V, Catturn V, whatever you want to call it, is ready. Let's fire it up. It does lift slowly. I mean, it has enough thrust to weight ratio to get off the non-existing pad. And it roars very mightily down range. But it works, it flies, nothing is exploding, because nothing can yet explode in this game. There is no damage, there are no collisions. Well, there are collisions now, but they don't do anything. There is no impact damage or impact destruction. Keep that in mind, we'll talk about that later. But what we do have are beautiful cloud layers here and a lot of nice visual effects going on with those plumes. Looking rather good, even though those cargo adapters on top are not really as nice visually as I had hoped. And there's also another problem, which we will see in a little while. First, let's stage the second stage. There we go. And we're heading out further out of the atmosphere and raising our periapsis. Still not in a stable orbit, of course, but we are going to switch to the third stage. At least that's what I wanted to do, because when I hit the staging button, well, it did something. It wouldn't separate, and this is a problem that would persist, unfortunately, during my experiments. So there was only one thing I could do. Again! Yes, I had to build this again, at least in part, And keen-eyed viewers will have noticed that the rocket is a bit more girthier, starting with the first and second stage. And that added mass, yeah, well, it's not really the added mass, it's more like my incompetence with calculating thrust-to-weight ratios. But at least the staging works fine, so I could at least test that on the ground. Nevertheless, back to the drawing board. Again! Not here though, this was still the first attempt where I had to burn off a little bit more fuel until I reached a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1. And I thought maybe we still have enough to get this thing into orbit anyway. But not only is the rocket a little bit fatter on the bottom, this is due to the new fairing parts I put on the top of the rocket between the payload and the third stage and the third stage and the second stage. Reason being that these fairing parts have a different slant angle, but they are also much better at the job that I intended them for. Alright, time to fire our second stage. There we go. And now the big question is, will this now also work in space and not only on the ground while lying down inside the Florida marshlands? Here we go, we have reached the end of this stage, and yes, this is looking rather well. So we do have to do another maneuver, or at least raise our periapsis at apoapsis, so I'm doing a maneuver here to do that. We still should have enough delta V left after this maneuver to get our translunar injection, at least normally we would. But you will see later why we won't this time. So yeah, a lot of trial and error went into this, both during the build as well as during flying this monstrosity. We are now in an orbit, and of course we now want to get to Luna, to the moon, and for this I'm using the flight planner tool that is integrated into the game. So it's trying to calculate how we get there the best way. Lots of progress bars going on here. And then it tells me it's almost 9,000 meters per second of delta V. That's a bit much, and as you can see here, it almost does a 90-degree angle away from my orbit, so that's not good. Again! So I tried again, and this time I tried to do a better orbital insertion from the launch point, and I also tried to have more power on this. There is a 6th engine hidden inside the 5th engine there. Thankfully, we don't have any thermal damage yet, so otherwise in Kerbal Space Program, if you do that, these engines would probably burn each other up. Alright, once again a beautiful ascent. We're above the cloud layer and everything is looking stable. Always nice to see how the plumes expand when we get outside of the atmosphere. Really beautiful work the developers at Rocketworks did here for Kitten Space Agency. Stage separation coming up again. This time it's a lot higher if you remember how high we were previously. And that's of course because we now had more power to punch us out of the atmosphere. Okay, the orbit lines are also now a little bit higher around the globe than they were before. The problem with all these beautiful clouds is that you don't really see as well where you are around the globe, because you don't see any landmarks anymore if the only thing you see is clouds. But still, we got our orbit, and then of course we got Luna as our target. You might have noticed the sphere of influence orb around the target I selected. This is also something that Kerbal Space Program 2 did and was, in my opinion, a valuable addition to the sequel. Looking at our orbit, we're not completely in a equatorial orbit, but it shall do. This is the ground track feature that was introduced a while ago. And now when we calculate our transfer to Luna, things should be a little bit better. Yes, now we only have a third of the delta V required to get to Luna compared to previously. So that's good, and that's also within our margins. So here we go. We've switched from the second stage to the third stage, which is not in line with history, of course, because in history, or during the real Apollo missions, the third stage would perform the translunar injection burn on its own. It would also do the final stages of the orbital maneuver around Earth. So the second stage would not even reach orbit with the Saturn V for the Apollo missions. Alright, we got our encounter, but it's a bit of a high orbit, so I did an adjustment burn a little bit later after launching. Here we go, that's how we do it. And then I was on an impact trajectory, which was fine. I planned to change the orbit later anyway, and there should be enough delta V in that command module to do so. And here we go, we're going to extract our lander out of our third stage, of course. But before we can do that, we have to get rid of these decouplers, and we don't want to damage anything, well, there isn't any damage right now, but we also don't want to use the impact to create some adverse orbital changes, because that thing flies away with a lot of force. The next part was tedious. First off, I was wondering why setting the target I was able to do that on my own vehicle and why everything now lit up red. Not sure if that was intentional, because later on when I loaded a save game this was no longer the case. But what was really tedious was apparently my placement of the reaction control systems, because pitching and yawing also turned into some translation at the same time, so I always had to correct this. I really need to fix that in future iterations. What you see here is the very much abbreviated version, because I spent more than 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, until I reached this point where automatically the docking mechanism engaged. Yes, this was something that was added 2 or 3 updates ago, and I haven't done it in a previous video, or didn't really mention or show it to you. What I wanted to show you now was getting the lander out of the third stage, but it was kind of stuck after staging the decoupler, but it kind of didn't, and then it staged the descent stage, and that was not what I wanted. So, of course, we had to do it again. Yes, but this time I just fired the lander outside of the third stage, which worked, so there is no collision going on, nothing was really stuck. It was some weird thing going on with the decoupler that didn't want to fire. And then I skipped the entire docking alignment thing by just right-clicking on the docking port and clicking dock. Nice! Okay, now it's time to do our maneuver, or not our maneuver, to just travel to the moon. There it is. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we are doing our trajectory change so we can actually get an orbit around the moon. And here we do our burn to get our circularization going on. Another weird thing that was happening as soon as I was docked, I could no longer do right clicks on the lander module until I separated those with undocking. Not sure if that is intentional or a bug, but it was kind of weird. What was also weird was some performance issues that I encountered during this mission. And they only reared their head a little bit later on. And the reason for those being, I could no longer, the effect was I could no longer do time warp beyond a certain limit. But before I tell you about that, let's look at this. Remember how that lander worked earlier, how it was fine and did descend flawlessly? For some reason, after undocking, the engines would want to gimbal to the left or to the right, depending on your orientation, and I was not able to keep this thing oriented correctly. Once more, just firing the engine results in them doing something, and I was not able to fix that. I have no idea how that happened, so I had only one choice. Again. Yeah, kind of loaded this vehicle and warped it here via the set orbit debug menu. So yeah, kind of cheating, but kind of not, because the game cheated me. And while we're looking at the descent, let me tell you about the performance issue I encountered. For some reason, when I time warped, the game kind of stalled. It was like in the single digits FPS or even lower than 1 FPS. Reason was that my translunar injection stage, the third stage you saw earlier, was also on an impact trajectory to the moon. And it impacted and then it bounced around on the moon. And every time I time warped, it had to calculate that bouncing around on the moon as well, in addition to my orbit stuff. And while I was talking to you about those things, here we go, we landed. By the way, I solved it by opening the console and typing in destroy and then the name of the vehicle that made the problems, the spent stage. Yeah, speaking of problems, those RCS modules are way too powerful for this lander. I made a backflip only using RCS, look at that. And now, speaking of backflips, I tried to EVA a kitten to get a nice thumbnail, and yeah, it totally glitched out when it came into contact with the lunar surface, so that's not good. So no flag, no footprints, just getting back to the command and service module, and the stage worked flawlessly as it did in our tests. And then of course we have to get this thing back into orbit. So what I'm trying here is to try to orient it in such a way that I don't have that much of an inclination difference to my vehicle already in orbit. But in order to do that correctly, I of course have to switch to the map view, and we're getting close. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. I then had to do a inclination change maneuver where we got really close, and then another transfer to get it even closer. And then this was also a lot of tedious work to get this close so I could perform the docking. Meaning, yes, again, right-clicking on the docking part and hitting dock. But also, not sure what's your experience when you play Kitten Space Agency. Is the RCS fuel also running out as quickly for you as it is for me? I have the feeling that the consumption of the RCS propellant is super high. Maybe that's realistic, maybe it isn't. I don't know, I don't have anything to compare it to. And yeah, we undock again because now we have imagined that the crew from the lander would come back to the command and service module before it returns to Earth. Alright, time to wrap this up. Is this already a game? Well, we have the vehicle builder, we can build multiple vehicles, we can dock them together, we can fly to at least the moon and land on it and return from it. But it's all still very unpolished, and there are some hiccups here and there, and there are some weird things happening that will scare away players that are not yet familiar with how these early pre-alpha things work. I mean, this is really an early access game, not just an unfinished game where they slap early access on it to earn some money. And the developers are very much working on it and doing a lot in a very short amount of time. There's basically 2 or 3 updates every week to this, and every time there's something interesting in there. So if you're interested in that, as I mentioned earlier, stay tuned to this channel and keep subscribed so you won't miss when the big things hit the scene. Or you can head over to the Kitten Space Agency Discord and hang out there and watch the release notes on their version history channel. And if you really enjoy what I do on this channel, you could head over onto Patreon, where you can see all my videos ad-free for a small monthly contribution. And if you choose one of the higher tiers, your name will show up here, together with all of these wonderful people. Thank you so much for your support. And also a big thank you to the developers for Kitten Space Agency to even making this and keeping up with a very vocal community that keeps wanting a lot of things from them. But so far, they're delivering. And now I have to think about the next mission that I can attempt. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.